am a resident of Boulder City. My name is Douglas Merkler. My wife and I have lived here for about 18 years. I work as a soil scientist for the USDA Department of Agriculture. I'm the resource soil scientist for the state of Nevada. This meeting is hosted tonight by a group of citizens, every one of them citizens, residents of Boulder City, that became concerned, and we wrote a letter. We weren't really happy with the speed and the response of local units of government, state government, county government, and we wrote a letter to the director of EPA and to the director of the Atlanta Disease Control Center asking for help. As a result of those letters, tonight we have EPA with us here with an expert on amphibole toxicity on fibers, and we have the two geologists that discovered these minerals in the Boulder City area to give you guys a brief talk and information about this. In addition, we invited from the state epidemiologist department, where'd he go? I gotta see your name again. Eisen Azam. And all these three and Eisen will join us for a panel discussion for about an hour, and we're going to have you guys ask them questions. So I will facilitate the panel. We're going to be cordial and collegial and nice. The only way that this is going to happen in a manner that we can help this community is that we're going to have to do this together. There isn't Boulder City or Clark County or the state of Nevada cannot afford to do what needs to be done. And the only way that we can get the help that we need is we got to have the state of Nevada invite the resources into the state to help us. Okay? So only way that's going to happen is we got to work together. So with that kind of as a premise, I'd like to get started, maybe dim the lights here in the front part. And I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Rodney Metcalf. He specializes in geochemistry and formation of minerals. And Rod is really the one, as a mineralogist, that discovered that these minerals were present here. And his effort and his work has been repeatedly validated by tests that were done by consulting firms by the state of Nevada, looking at the I-11 to go in. So he's the guy, right, for this. Tell us about this. So why don't we go ahead and let him begin?
Okay, so thanks everybody for coming. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. If you can't, holler at me, because I tend to get really animated when I'm loud, and so I try to keep it down, and I may do that. So if you can't hear, please let me know. So I'm going to assume that most of us know what some of these issues are. That in 2013 we published a paper with Brenda Buck and myself and some others reporting naturally occurring asbestos here. We've had some issues with the state of Nevada Division of Public and Behavioral Health. Do I get that right? I'm going to call you Nevada Health. And we've had some disagreements. I will say that we met for the first time face-to-face about 2 weeks ago with the Nevada health officials. They were kind enough to fly down from northern Nevada to meet with us. We met for almost 4 hours. It was a very cordial meeting. They listened to a lot of what we had to say. I don't think they budged much on their position, and we haven't budged on ours. We did agree on a few things. One was that we keep the lines of communication open between us. We also agreed that the last thing we want to do is to cause panic amongst people and to unduly worry them. But we feel that the public needs to know this stuff, and so we're going to continue to share it with you and with the media. If I go to the first slide, Doug. Okay. So, why are we concerned about asbestos? Well, it's known to cause a bunch of diseases, and the one you probably know the most about is mesothelioma. It's a very rare disease. We looked at it with epidemiology data from the state. They've looked at the same data. We interpret it differently, but the reason we picked mesothelioma is it's the clear signal that people have been exposed to fibers. With almost without exception, if you've got mesothelioma, it's because you were exposed to fibers. There are a few cases that are others, but that's the case. but it's a very rare disease, and as far as a public health concern, mesothelioma is not the big concern, because the vast majority of diseases that people will get that will affect people are other things like lung cancers, and then a bunch of non-malignant diseases like asbestosis, pleural plaques, pleural effusions, and pleural fibrosis, and increasingly it's being recognized that autoimmune diseases can be triggered by these fibers. One of the things about these other diseases, as opposed to mesothelioma and cancer, is the amount of exposure you need to trigger these is what the toxicologists tell us. I think David Berry will speak to this. For these non-malignant diseases are much lower. You need much less exposure to be at risk for these diseases. So again, mesothelioma I'm going to talk about a bit. That's where a lot of the disagreement between us and the state has been, is about interpretation of health data for mesothelioma. And again, we're looking at that because it's a clear indicator of people being exposed to fiber. Next. Okay. So part of our disagreement with the state about the health data has to do with how we look at risk versus how the state has looked at risk. And risk is really a model. So when you hear risk, you probably think that's a single thing, but it depends on what you're doing and how you define risk. Risk is a model. It has assumptions and limitations. How you set up a risk study depends on what questions you're asking and what you're doing. There are statistical models that use past populations. There are probability models that are trying to predict into the future about risk. Risk is an important concept in business, and certainly we wouldn't define risk in business the same way we would define it in public health. So when somebody talking about risk, you need to ask yourself, how are they defining it and how are they measuring and understanding risk? And we in the state health people really look at this differently. But risk is a major topic for geologic hazard research and for medical geology, which is the kind of stuff that Brendan Buck and I are doing with this asbestos research. So how is the state health looking at models for asbestos risk? They're really looking at mesothelioma, so are we, but we agree on that. That's a good way to look at it. They're looking at past populations. So if I can have the next slide. So these little quotes up here, I've got several of these in here. After George Knapp's initial television presentations in May, the state sent him a series of talking points. So I've got some quotes up here, and these again come out of an email that the state sent to George Knapp, and he forwarded that to us and asked for comment, so that's where these come from. So the state looks at incident rates, and that's the reporting people being diagnosed. This diagram actually looks at death rates, and the state thinks that incident rates are the better way to look at it. In fact, this map would be pretty much the same for incidence rates. I took this out of the CDC. And so they say that they're looking at these data by comparing state to state. And so they're comparing our incident rates for mesothelioma with other states. And they say, and we agree with this, 32 other states have a higher rate of mesothelioma incidence than we do. And they also say that there's no evidence of increased risk, and the underlines are mine, by the way, not theirs. The increased risk of mesothelioma in Nevada or Clark County. And you have to ask yourself, what do they mean by increased risk? And what they mean is increased relative to other states. Is at least my understanding of what they mean. And Dr. Zan can correct me if he thinks this is wrong. And so this is a map of death, not of incident rate, so this is a little different than they would look at it. But it's very similar, and the state of Nevada is down here pretty low, just as the incident rates say. And so this is fairly comforting, I guess, should be. But let's look at another map. Next one. So this is also a map from the CDC. It's a little bit different years. It's a little year later and longer than the other map. But this is a county level look at incident rates of mesothelioma. And so if I look at this map, I'm not nearly as comforted as I was from the other map. And you know, you could say, well, okay, this is a bigger population. A lot of these blank counties have less than 5, and so they don't report any rate because that's just too small a statistics to do that with. But you look at this, Atlanta's not on here, the whole Colorado Front Range isn't on here, the whole Wasatch Front Range in Utah, and they're big populations that aren't on this map. So I only put this up not to say that Clark County is really bad and you should be scared, but just to say the way you frame the question, whether you do it at the state level or the county level, makes a difference in your result. That's a risk model difference. And so that's what this is about. Next. And so the thing about mesothelioma is it's, again, almost without exception, it's caused by asbestos exposure. So, you know, we could take comfort in saying that other states have higher rates, but every one of those mesothelioma cases needs an explanation. The question really is, how did they get exposed? And traditionally, most of the exposure has been through occupational exposure, people who work in the asbestos industry. The question we ask is, are there non-occupational exposures in data sets? Next one. And so we did a study, and this is where we got into some hot water with the state. We had first accessed Nevada Cancer Registry data, and then we made a mistake, and they told us we couldn't use the data anymore. And so we went around them and went to the Center for Disease Control and got the same set of data. So what was done in this look at the data, and we published this in January. Truth in Advertising, Doug Merkler, your host, is a co-author on this paper. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not here to defend this particular study. Francine Bauman, the lead author, is really the epidemiologist, but I can explain it a little bit to you. So what she did was, assuming that mesothelioma has a long lead time, from dosing to disease, the incubation period can be 10, 20, 30 years. If you're occupationally exposed, you're most likely a male. You most likely didn't get exposed to initially until you're an adult, and so this disease doesn't show up until late in life. And so Dr. Bauman's approach was says, well, let's look at if people are being environmentally exposed, they may be being exposed from birth, and women hypothesized that women might be exposed at rates equal to men if it's not occupational. And so she looked at county level data for Southern Nevada, and the takeaway message here is that the percent of mesothelioma deaths in people under the age of 55, in other words, you take all the mesothelioma deaths, how many of those people are under 55, that percentage is higher in Clark County than it is in some other states. Alaska is a state with a pretty high rate. New Hampshire is a state with a pretty low rate. And the male-female ratio for all ages is almost 3 to 1 in Nevada, but when you go below 55, it's 1 to 1. So the state disagrees with both our methodology and our interpretations. And again, I'm not the epidemiologist, so I'm not the person to argue that. I don't want to sell myself as an expert in epidemiology. But our takeaway message for this is that the low male-female ratio suggests non-occupational exposure. And there's one person in this set who was under the age of 20. People getting mesothelioma at those ages, we think, means they've been exposed from a very young age. They could have been exposed because their parent worked in asbestos industries and brought it home. We don't know how they got, and we say that at the end of our paper. There's a lot of questions, but we think this suggests we need to do more work. That's our takeaway message from that. Doug? Am I long, Doug?
Well,
how's my timing?
You're awesome. Keep going.
Okay. One of the things that the state and we agree on, and these are again 2 more of their talking points in this email they sent to George Knapp, is we don't know where the individuals who died in Nevada due to mesothelioma were exposed or contracted the diseases. This is a town with a lot of retirees. People could have been exposed, they could have moved here and they contracted disease. We say that at the end of our paper, we understand that. But the opposite's true too. People could have moved out from here. So more study is needed. You need to actually go in and interview these families and find out individual histories to understand how did these people get exposed. I'm not comforted by the fact that our rate isn't much higher. I want to know whether or not a local exposure that we could prevent is the reason these people got sick. That's what we want to know. The other thing the state said, and this really bothered me, and I'll give Dr. Zan a chance to address this later if he would like, is they also said, remember that Southern Nevada has been exposed for a long time to naturally occurring asbestos, and that didn't translate into mesothelioma. In my mind, I have a hard time reconciling those 2 statements. I don't know how they got mesothelioma, but they didn't get it by this exposure. To me, those are 2 mutually exclusive statements, and I just don't understand how this. So and this is a minor point, I realize, but But if we don't know how people got mesothelioma, we need to find that out. And let's remember, before I go on, that mesothelioma isn't the abundant disease from fibers. This is just the signal. It's the asbestosis, all those non-cancers that we're really worried about, whose exposure levels are much smaller. Next. Well, I feel like I'm shouting. I'm really sorry for the people in the front row. And so back to this idea of risk. So in geologic hazard research, like for earthquakes or floods or things, we often use probabilistic. We're trying to predict into the future and probabilities and try to understand it. And so often we talk about hazard identification and risk assessment. Lots of governments do this for their citizens for geologic hazards. And so it's the hazard times exposure equals risk. Risk is the probability of some kind of adverse outcome, illness in this case, to a population or a subpopulation or an individual. And so from our mind, we see a hazard. It's the minerals that are here, it's their toxicity, and their ability to cause disease is real. We also see exposure pathways. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the minerals here at the end of my presentation. David Berry from the EPA is going to talk about what they've learned about toxicology of amphibole fibers from Libby, Montana, long study and some of the diseases there. Brenda Buck's going to talk somewhat about the pathways and concentrations. A thing about asbestos exposure, unlike the risk of driving your car, when you park your car and get out, your risk goes to zero. And for asbestos, you accumulate risk every time you're exposed because those fibers stay in your lungs. So every exposure is an additive effect. And so if you really want to understand the risk of a population or even an individual, you need to understand that. You need to understand this to get this, to be able to calculate some kind of risk factor. Now, we don't have enough information to do that, but we think we have enough information to say this is not zero. And it could be significant. We just don't know yet because we don't know enough of that yet. And Brenda will talk about that. Next. Okay, I'm just going to talk about the minerals for a minute to close my part out. So again, in 2013, we published this paper. It found this fibrous mineral actinolite. There's only 6 minerals that are regulated as asbestos. Actinolite is one of those. To call it asbestos, it has to be a particular mineral, which means it has to have a particular chemical composition. That's how we classify minerals, is by their chemical composition. And then it has to be fibrous. These are all scanning electron microscope images from a rock at the Martha Peking Elementary School. This is collected in a dust trap, the upper right in Boulder City, and the other one's from a soil in Henderson. This is one of our chemical plots. You don't need to understand all this, but just that these minerals are actinolite. That's the regulated mineral. It's known to be toxic. It's a regulated carcinogenic mineral. Next. Now, across the river in Arizona, we have another set of minerals, and these are the same minerals that were at Libby, Montana. Libby, Montana is dominated by this mineral called granite. The plot at the top is from a published paper from a U.S. Geological Survey geologists and a whole host of authors. With their plot to classify these minerals, we reproduced their plot with ours from Arizona. These are the same minerals. These are very toxic minerals. They're not regulated. They fall outside the regulatory definition of asbestos, but they're still known to be toxic, and they're both very fibrous, so they have the right morphology to get airborne and to be respirated. Next. So this map on the right is a map that we made. It was published in our 2013 paper. It's a map we used to go looking for asbestos and what we thought we knew about how they formed. The red areas are bedrocks. They're these things we call granite plutons, which host the asbestos. And so these are pictures of what that looks like in the field. Those are about 17 to 13 million years old. Those plutons, they were altered, and these minerals were formed right after that. And almost immediately they were exposed to the surface by faulting. They were eroded. Next slide, Doug. They were eroded, and these big piles of sedimentary material formed. And in those sedimentary materials are eroded bits of this asbestos. That's the yellow on the map. That makes a big footprint. That's really where we're concerned about the dust being generated, is from those deposits. Next one, Doug. And so this is our predictive map from 2013. This is the same map. We've muted the colors a bit and changed them. This is for another piece of work. But all those sample locations on there are places that we've gone, collected samples, analyzed them, tested them, and they're all positive for asbestos minerals. And so our model is holding up. We think we understand how these form and can predict where we'll find them. Last slide, I believe. So what I've told you is how we kind of look at risk. It's the hazard times the exposure gives us the risk. This is a little different than what the state's been doing. We know these minerals are present. Dave Berry, who's going to come up next, is going to talk about toxicity of these, and then Brenda will talk about exposure. And that's the end of my presentation. To the right.